My name is I'm a professor of science, language and society here at the University of Nottingham, and I direct the Making Science Public DB-funded program of research. And lots of the research fellows who work on this program are here, and also Dr Rahul, who's the moderator. Anyway, that's enough about me. I think I want to highlight two aspects from this conference. One is the impact of the impact agenda, which has been discussed off and on during the conference. And the last speaker on our panel, storyteller on our panel will be Kate Roach, who has written a fictional story about impact, which I've uploaded on our Making Science Public blog, so you can read it, but she also read it out, and then you can discuss it, because sometimes a fictional story gives people a good opportunity to think with, I think. But before we come to the fiction, I thought we'd say first the facts. So we have three speakers. First Phil, then Reiner, and then Jason, and you. So Phil.
Right.
Okay, yeah, 10 minutes. Phil,
don't worry about the introduction.
You don't.
Yeah, just make sure you tell me when it's 10 minutes, otherwise I'll waffle on and on and on. Right, so I am delighted to see so many of you here to the bitter end. It's fantastic. My involvement with this as an organiser, what I really wanted to do was try to bring together the sort of people on the physical sciences side with the social sciences side. Because we do an awful lot of discussion about what those social scientists do and say, and the social scientists similarly do. Well, those scientists, they really don't do it right, and what they should do is this. There's a hell of a lot of preconceptions and misconceptions, and if there's one way or one theme that couples together, and it's a fairly trite theme, but it's an important theme, nonetheless, that couples together research, politics, media, and impact, it's communication, and how we talk to each other, and what sort of preconceptions and misconceptions we bring to the table. And I think that over the last couple of days, we've seen that there's still some residual misunderstandings that maybe I'm responsible, or I share those misunderstandings, but I'm not entirely convinced. I think there are very important differences in methodology, perception, between the social sciences and the physical sciences. But what I'm going to talk about is a little bit broader than that. I'll point you to Sylvia's wonderful blog, where this is the point she made yesterday in the panel, Sylvia McLean, where some of the comments were many scientists shouldn't communicate with the media, scientists trying to change policy are communicating with the wrong people, scientists are asking the wrong questions, scientists are self-indulgent. She's taken those a little bit out of context, as she admits herself, but nonetheless that's the message you get, and it's stereotype upon stereotype upon stereotype. So notice this, if you Google scientist and look at Google images, right, that's the second most popular image. I'm pretty bloody certain Einstein, as a theoretical physicist, never wore a white coat. And if he did, it was for a photo opportunity. So, there are stereotypes there, and if we want to communicate with each other, we have to get rid of those preconceptions and misconceptions. Here's, we've had the scientist stereotypes, let's look at the social scientists. So, how many of you familiar with this book? Yeah. Micah Billig's book. Okay. How many of you happy with it? Do you think it's a reasonable?
I think some of it is fair.
Yeah, yes. I think it's very fair, because any sociology papers I try to pick up and read, dear me, it's a hard slog, right? So there's an awful lot of dense text here, deliberately. Billig shows how technical terminology is regularly less precise than simpler language. Linguistic problems with the noun-based terminology that social scientists habitually use, reification and normalization rather than the corresponding verbs reify and normalize. So there are, on the other hand, I've read and interacted with quite a number of social scientists who can write incredibly clearly. But we as physicists are trained in the main to try and get our message across as simply and clearly as possible. We don't dress it up in horrendously, we shouldn't dress it up in horrendously technical language. I find it really difficult to read sociology papers for exactly the reason Billig points out. So, there is a two cultures divide. I think I'm very willing to argue this. It's not the same two cultures as C.P. Snow argued quite a number of decades ago in terms of the arts and humanities versus the sciences. In principle, I would say that fundamental physics is probably closer to the arts and humanities than some of the social sciences are to other sciences. So it's, if you want to read, I wrote a blog. It was written deliberately to ruffle some feathers. So if you want to go and read that and comment, I'd be delighted, and I'll obviously respond. On the politics side, I'm trying to cover in a rather sort of ad hoc and scattergun fashion the various aspects of the conference. I was involved in this last year. I was lucky enough to get allocated a place on this scheme, which is the Royal Society Pairing Scheme. For those of you who are interested, and those of you who are here, scientists obviously have an interest in sort of politics and media and research. Tomorrow is the closing day, but it's actually a really, really short application form. You could easily do it in a couple of hours. So if you want to apply for this, I really recommend it. But what it brought home to me, I don't want to be the voice of doom and gloom like David Calhoun, who's a bit of a hero of mine, but you know. But what this really brought home to me is that we can make all the noises, and politicians can make all the noises about evidence-based policy. Science is down here. Science and evidence and data are down here. All the other political aspects, including, for example, how does it play to the Daily Mail, and what's the budget for this, really, in many cases, completely dominate any type of evidence-based policy. Right, where's Stuart? Stuart gave a great talk about the influence of corporate funding on research. On the first day, what I really was fascinated by was the panel where Daniela Fanelli had a bit of a tete-a-tete with the other members of the panel, some of whom are still here, I think. And what that was about was really, can data and evidence actually ever be unbiased? Here's what the research councils are doing to ensure bias in what we do. I'm not joking, right? Draft the impact summary very early in your preparation so that it informs the design of your research. So work out what your goals are and to design your research program accordingly. I would say that's a perversion of the scientific method. Even worse, point number 5, most proposals aim to engage with beneficiaries and end users. No, not mine, and not very many in physics, for example. Where possible, and for impact activities to be more effective, end users should be involved from the outset of the research design process to maximize the potential uptake and application of the research. And then we wonder why we have, I'm not saying this is always the case, and Stuart was keen to make this point, we wonder why the corporatization of science is corrupting what we do. This is Orbit Bloomstone. If you're not familiar with Orbit Bloomstone and his battle with a pharmaceutical giant and how he lost his job because of that and how they distorted his research results, look him up. You'll find lots on Google. It's, again, I'm not beginning to suggest that all academic industry collaborations work like this. Indeed, I'm involved in some. I coordinate a European network, many of the fellows in that network are here, where we've got strong industrial involvement. But, nonetheless, if you have something like this, where you're saying, basically what we want you to do is much closer to industrial R&D than fundamental science, you've got to expect there's going to be problems. This is a great book. What's very interesting, it's about 10 years old, 2005 I think it was published, Jennifer Washburn, Corporate Corruption of Higher Education. Great to see disturbing to see the parallels, not great at all, disturbing to see the parallels of what's happening in the UK over the last 10 years. Where's Alistair? So Alistair blogged about this. Talked about this yesterday, he's blogged about it. This is, covered politics, let's talk about research and media and how we get our message out there. And I think a reason to be optimistic, let's try and dispel some of that doom and gloom, hopefully Dave will be happy with this, is that this type of thing is where you've got post-publication peer review is happening more and more. So instead of the paper being that, well, we've published this paper, therefore it's right, and it might take, in some cases, 3 to 4 years to try and get a criticism of that paper through. This type of thing's happening, where blogs are playing a huge role in directing science and quality control. So this is the paper Alistair referred to. There's lots more in his blog called At the Interface. This is the worst example. So this isn't a long time ago. This is last year, August last year. Some very suspicious TEM images in nanolipids, right? You don't need to be a scientist. You don't need to have any understanding. My 10-year-old daughter queried this. So they claim that you get these nanorods, gold nanorods, you put them down from solution and they form little structures like that. I've worked with nanorods and nanoparticles and that looks, you go, wow, how, what, why? You see the problem? Right? Cut and paste job. That is shocking from so many perspectives. Either the arrogance or the stupidity of the person who put this together, one thing. The shocking dereliction of duty of the referees. I don't care. You know, we're all busy, but if you accept to review this paper, and it's about how nanorods form structures like this, the first thing you say, as a chemist or a physicist, and this is not a crap journal, this is nano letters, so many people would assume, many physicists and chemists would take nano letters to be the next tier down, after Nature and Science, PNAS, nano is the next tier down. I don't care how busy you are, that should not get through. And it was picked up. So my daughter said, Daddy, why didn't I do the cut and paste correctly? She's 10. She can use PowerPoint a hell of a lot, and Photoshop a hell of a lot better than that. In this case, because of that blog pressure, and only because of that blog pressure, they withdrew it. So you can see it was published June the 19th, withdrawn on August the 15th. Without that blog pressure, this would still be in the literature. Indeed, even with that blog pressure, I'm willing to bet this will pick up citations over the next few years, even though it's been withdrawn. There's a very high profile case via something called PubPeer. If you haven't heard of PubPeer, Google it, start using it. How many? 2 minutes, okay, good. Start using it, just as long as we get the message across about PubPeer across. It's a wonderful post-publication peer review platform. It has its problems, as Athene Donald alluded to, but nonetheless, I really am quite happy that PubPeer is there and it's allowing this type of discussion. This was some very dodgy stem cell research, which again was picked up rapidly within a week of publication by PubPeer. And the reason I like, well, one of the reasons I've got involved with PubPeer and like it so much is that we're involved in embroiled, I think is a better word, in a fairly long-standing debate on whether nanoparticles have stripes on them, which might seem like a very narrow issue, in some sense it is, but when the argument is that those stripes affect the cellular uptake of nanoparticles, it becomes less of a sort of minor issue. And now, this is something I referred to yesterday or the day before, PubPeer has now got a really nice plugin for browsers, which allows you to see comments on PubPeer on different papers. That is great, that is really fantastic. The interesting thing is that in many cases, some of the difficulties can be due to faulty reasoning rather than fraudulence. But what's really important and what's really damaging to science, and it comes back to the whole medialization, if you want to call it, of that of science, is that too often headlines trump rigor in Science and Nature. That's not to say that there aren't great papers in Science and Nature, of course there are. However, what the difficulty in getting the paper into Science and Nature is not so much getting it through the peer review process, it's getting it past the editor in the first place. And the editor chooses the papers to send out to peer review on the basis of newsworthiness. And that's a real issue. With that, I'll shut up and pass on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Next speaker is Reiner.
Right. So when we thought about the conference topic, initially we had a small group of people in mind and had metaphors like dialogue or concepts like dialogue. We expanded and thought, okay, this will be a trilogue. Now we got 4. Is there a quadrilogue? I don't think so. So we came up with this circling the square. The question I want to put up here is, how far can we go in circling and how far should we go? So it's a sort of conceptual critical reflection from a sociological point of view. So this picture, Google Images, this is what one of the more appealing ones, so you could think it can be done, okay? Somehow it can be done. An alternative would be to say, well, in the process of doing that, there are some intersecting areas, and maybe that's what should be aimed at, because going for the whole thing might be problematic, and I'll try to show you why I think this is or could be. So this goes back to a point made by Sylvia McLean yesterday with the stereotyping that also Philip referred to just now, where she said, you know, this is stereotypes, but we are persons. So, you know, every individual is different. So if you think about it sociologically, the concept of role comes to mind. So a role would combine the individual with the institutional level. And I put a definition here, which is not from Wikipedia, no, but it's also online. So it's about behavior that can be expected. So there's sociologists speak about stabilized expectations if you talk about roles. So for example, the scientist would be expected, in an old terminology, to find or seek the truth. If you use a different vocabulary, you might maybe say they try to establish replicable knowledge or certified knowledge or credible knowledge, something like that. That's the role of the scientist. But what we also get, and we have experience with that, is so-called role hybrids. These are people who fulfill more than one role at the same time. So if you think about the relation between science and policy, so these would be the science policy wonks, or people at the interface, where it's very difficult to think of Ian Boyd. Is this, would you describe him as a scientist or as a policy advisor? He's both, and he can be both only because he has been or still is a scientist. So this is then very difficult to tease apart, and I think various participants at the conference are combining more than one role. Science journalists, so this is the media aspect, and then you know, to take Roger's topic here about advocates. So a scientist is convinced that something needs to be done in policy terms and becomes a policy advocate. Now this is, I say, shifting constellations. This is something that will change over time. So you can't say this is what we will predict. The scientist will just do the science, or if they are the interface, that's where they are. They can shift to different roles, of course. The question is, how many of the four roles we have identified here, so politics, the media, science itself, what is the fourth? And now civil society. Civil society, so that could be interest groups of any kind, NGOs or business. And if you look at that, the expectations these four groups have of each other, you get to a matrix like this. So this is very superficial, because there can be, of course, different kinds of researchers, social scientists, natural scientists, humanities, and so on, different journalists. But what I want to point is, first of all, they relate to each other. So this is the light green diagonal, and what you see there is a lot of competition or cooperation. So you are competing against other researchers, with other journalists, and NGO landscape is full with different NGOs and so on. So if you look across the second row, that a researcher expects from journalists that they report accurately, and sometimes they are tempted to sell the science, to sex up their findings. They want support, if possible, from civil society, and they want to have some relevance, or what we call nowadays impact in policy terms. So the journalists, then, you could describe the role as searching for a good story. They use pretty much everything as a news source. Other journalists, civil society, and politicians. Yes, NGOs or business interest groups, they want evidence to bolster their case, and they want to gain influence. So the politicians then, in search for evidence, Ian Boyd told us he doesn't believe they're always cherry picking, but he admitted there is a lot of that going on. So they want to have some evidence for things they have in mind. spinning a story through the media is what politicians are very good at. That's their main job, probably. How can they get support from civil society? How to enroll other members of society? And we have competition. So if you think about that and combining roles, how far could it go? How far should it go? We realize that there is a problem if you think, you know, the more circling we have, the more role combinations you get, the better. Because, you know, first 4 hypotheses before I come to the end and answer that question. So these hypotheses are derived from what you just saw on the matrix slide. These are the role expectations that can be pinned down. So in some very general way, they are predictive. I mean, they are not the laws of physics and not gravity and so on, but this is a general expectation we can make, I would say, but you can test them and maybe sometimes you find anomalies. Now, if you say, if you think about combining more than 2 or go for the full circle, total role hybrid, so what would that be? That would be a researcher who is also a science writer, who is also somehow putting forward policy proposals and getting into campaigning style. If you imagine such a person, I don't know if that person exists. If I follow some people on Twitter who are scientists who nearly fall into that category without naming names, and I think that's a very dangerous thing if you are in that place and still saying I'm a scientist, but you are also campaigning with NGOs and you have a strong policy position and write media or write for the media. That's the total role hybrid, I would say, and is highly problematic. Why? Because science would be losing credibility and you are just seen as another party, a very colorful maybe, and very desired if it's to do with evidence, but also one very controversial. So I think, just to come to an end here, if that's undesirable, the implication also is that science or researchers generally should probably reassess what their expectations are of other parts in society. So we had this quote there several times this morning: if there were only more scientists, we would have better policy decisions. And I think that I'm with Steve Reiner that I don't think there's any evidence for that. Or the famous one about the relation to the media. We need to communicate better. If we get our story across more effectively, society would be a better place. Somehow the idea that we could, through enlightenment and getting journalists to write what the scientists want, make a change, I think that's naive. And first of all, because it doesn't recognize that the media operates in a different mode. They want to publish good news stories. They don't want to reflect any interest group that comes to them in the way the interest group wants to see themselves. So there is a misconception on the part of scientists. And I think that's also problematic. Okay.
Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. I'm just going to speak from here. And I want you all to just run a little experiment in your head. Imagine you took all of the speakers you've seen over the past couple of days, and the panelists as well, and you tossed them in a room and you locked the door and you said you have 3 months in which to come up with a curriculum that you have to teach in 1 year, and out of it is going to come graduates who are going to run the future of the science policy interface for the next 30 years. How well do you think that process will go? Well, I can honestly say it's not as painful as you might think, and it actually is quite an energizing process to go through. This is essentially what we've been doing in this new department that we've been setting up at UCL, the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Public Policy. To give a little background, there were 3 of us on August 1st last year when the department was formally set up by the Senate of UCL. There's now 30 plus people in the department, and for my sins, I have the dubious honor of being head of department and trying to corral this, which means mostly what I do is HR processes and hiring people. But one of the main things we've been focused on in this first year is setting up a master's program. And from this September, we'll be taking in the first cohort of students into a Master's of Public Administration program designed to do exactly what I just outlined, to train future leaders in the field, in this interface between science, tech, and engineering knowledge. And by science, we're also definitely including social science knowledge with public decision-making processes writ large. So we're running a social experiment this year in how you design the curriculum and how you have exactly the same sorts of conversations that have been going on fantastically for the last couple of days here, but in the context of what's the most important thing to teach in a curriculum that is limited. We can't actually put the students through 100 hours of training a week. I've been told by HR that's not allowed. We can't do that to students. So it creates a situation where you're trying to debate and decide which are the most important ideas, which ones are most relevant to immediate practice. Now, to give a little more context, our faculty right now, with the 30-some people in the department, there's 6 faculty members, a range of postdoctoral fellows and other teaching fellows, and the balance is about 50-50 between people with natural science and engineering backgrounds, like myself, a physicist by training, and social science and policy backgrounds across a diversity of those backgrounds. And we have a mandate to grow the department to 20 faculty and quite a bit more growth over the next while to do to teach all the programs we're running. But the internal debates that we've been having have also been flavored around what we want our student population to look like. We're trying to have our student population be an equal mix of people coming in with the technical, natural science, engineering background, and social science and policy backgrounds. With the philosophy being the only way we can actually begin to address these sorts of issues is not to come up with one solution that we simply teach them, but rather to teach them first how to talk to and understand each other, and then ideally over the course of a year where they start having these sorts of conversations and gradually expand to be able to understand the diversity of perspectives around the table and the value of different ideas, to then be able to go out and mediate some of those conversations through different types of public decision-making processes, and starting to ask the question, what do those look like? Steve Reiner this morning did a very good job, as he always does, of articulating the different types of worldviews and how those connect to different types of disciplinary backgrounds or types of evidence that get put into the policy process. But one of the things that is the next step of that conversation isn't just how are they different and why do they fight, but given a world where you're guaranteed to have the differences of perspectives and guaranteed to have those tensions, how do you still make effective public decisions when you have a context of massive pressures on sustainability, massive pressures on inequality at every level of government and society? I don't have time to unpack the year worth of curriculum that we've been designing in these few minutes, but there are a few principles that we have come down to as being the characteristics of what we want this education to be able to give the students. Now you can ask me again, or you can ask any of us again in a year whether or not it worked in the first time we ran it, but at least this is our aspirations for the first time. The first is really to focus on literacy, but literacy in both directions. Literacy of science, certainly, an ability to understand different types of quantitative data, qualitative data, narratives that are generated out of the scientific enterprise, social scientific, natural science engineering, but not just for the policy and social science community, but also for the scientists themselves, to understand the links at all the stages from collecting rocks and measuring them to understand the historic climate change, the history of the climate of the planet, through to how that gets translated into thou shalt not pass 2 degrees Celsius. There's a lot of steps between there that need to be unpacked and understood. And a literacy of the modern scientific process, which I'm going to be a little provocative and say the scientific process of the 1800s isn't the scientific process of today. The scientific process of today, if you think about it more broadly, it has to encompass the translation, the mobilization of that scientific knowledge into the policy communities or into the broader world where it affects large scales of decision making. And I know, Phil, we're gonna have a nice debate about this. I can tell. I'm gonna pick on this one again in a few minutes, so don't worry. But equally, it's literacy of policy and public decision-making processes. And again, that's not just for the scientists and engineers that come in. Certainly there needs to be an understanding for the scientists and engineers about the different ways in which decisions are made, for better or worse, at different levels of government in which they intend to contribute to, or at different levels of civil society, or in the corporate world, if they want their knowledge to be relevant. But equally, it's amazing how many policymakers you could plunk out of Whitehall or out of the London authorities who wouldn't have any clue outside of their own office how the policy process unfolds. Not because they wouldn't want to, but because actually the contexts of policymaking are so contingent on the realities around any history of an organization or any social context in which that organization is operating. So being able to give both sides of both communities that we're bringing in the ability to read and understand the landscapes of the others and their own with a broader understanding is the first step. So literacy on both sides, I think, is quite important. And if there's one thing, there have been a variety of conversations today. I'm afraid I wasn't able to attend the last couple of days, but I heard from my colleagues who did about some of the fantastic conversations. But often the conversations end up focusing on one side of the literacy or the other without talking about the need for both of them to happen at the same time. And the second stage to that then is, as we build up the literacy, the question is, how do you then create mediators? How do you create that? Our goal for the graduates from our MPA program is for them to be able to go out and work in organizations that can effectively pull the different perspectives and communities together to provide a broad range of input to public decision-making processes, or for that matter, to research programs, to get to how universities are shaping their agenda, how universities are reaching out and mobilizing their knowledge in everything from their local community to their global community. And that role of mediation requires understanding the differences that are going to exist, but then also processes for getting people to understand each other, getting people to break down the communication barrier, the challenges with understanding social science, the challenges with understanding natural science. And this can range from doing things as innovative as running futures and horizon scanning processes that force people to think about imaginary futures that have a good way that are often a good way of breaking down people's assumptions about the way the world works and comparing different assumptions about what would create that future, through to simply running dialogue processes that are able, that similar to this conference, that bring together the communities to connect them. The third principle that I lay out is we want reflexive practitioners. As has come up a number of times in the sort of diagnosis of policy processes, it's easy for policy processes to fall into traps. Traps that can end up being, well, we have certain metrics that we have to achieve. In air pollution, we need to reach certain targets, or in climate change, we need to reach certain targets. So here's the metrics we're going to shoot for, and then everything in policy becomes about the metric as opposed to everything else, all the consequences of shooting for those metrics. One that I'm very familiar with personally is the global warming potential as a way of taking everything we put up in the atmosphere and just making it equivalent to carbon, despite the fact that sulfate aerosols or soot or dust have very different lifetimes in the atmosphere and very different impacts in the climate system. And the mobilization of global warming potential into policy has resulted in carbon markets that pay mostly for China to not produce HFCs rather than actually reducing any carbon emissions. Trying to understand ways that to be critically reflexive on the way technical knowledge is being mobilized into policy environments so that we can begin structuring different dialogues about adaptive governance, adaptive policy making, and integrating. There's the conversation in the earlier session about how do you bring engineering design principles into policy making. Well, some of it is in the language of adaptive governance or adaptive policy making. How do you create opportunities that don't just collect an evidence base and make a decision and say, right, we're done, but actually continue to revisit the fact that the evidence base will change, the policy itself will change the system that it's operating on, and therefore new evidence about new types of interactions in the system are needed to decide whether or not the policy is effective and to change the direction to deal with new things. Those are the three principles that despite all of the differences and backgrounds we've been bringing into this, into the design of this curriculum, we've come down to as being things that we can all agree on. We can all agree these are goals and objectives we want from students. Now, what bits of social science do they need literacy in? What bits of physical sciences do they need literacy in? Well, that's a debate we're going to continue to have I'm sure indefinitely as we revise our curriculum year after year, because it's not a static problem. It's not a simple answer, but rather an evolving answer in a dynamic process that we want to continue to evolve. And if there's one thing that I've learned from this process, framing the debate around, framing these sorts of discussions around what if you only had one 10-week course to teach students about this entire thing, what would you put in that course, is a great way to hone down to what is the real essence that of the discussions that you're getting across. It's a painful way of doing it because you really have to question what are the most valuable issues on the table. Very briefly, because I'm sure I'm crossing the time threshold, I did want to raise one other thing that the department is in the process of setting up and doing, and it's a policy institute. And the reason I want to raise this is in part to sort of jab another stick at Phil, just so that we can get more of a conversation going. But also because I think it gets to the question of, one of the questions that have been echoing around that Phil also said, what is the right balance in driving the scientific enterprise between blue sky science and science that is driven by the societal needs or to address societal problems or questions? The setup of our department is based on the premise, I should say, the hypothesis that there is a wealth of scientific, technical, and again, I use science broadly, forgive me, to include social science and engineering just as a shorthand. But there's a wealth of knowledge that is not making it into public decision-making processes, and we need better ways of mobilizing that interface. If you look at the interface, which has already been talked about, between corporations and universities, 30 years ago, there wasn't a very formalized interface when Stanford and MIT were setting up their tech transfer and business development units. Now, look at any major university, it's hard to find one that doesn't have a tech transfer and business development office. And they have practices and processes that have been evolved and developed over the last 30 years to be effective at bringing in revenue to the university and generating output into the local communities. We can argue about good or bad. We can argue about whether or not that's a good thing for the future of higher education or not. But they have been effective at least building those relationships. Where's the public decision-making equivalent? Where's the institutions that are mobilizing for our public decision makers that same sort of knowledge? Now, that doesn't come in the form of IP. It doesn't really work to walk up to an MP and give them a patent. That's actually not a very effective way of mobilizing knowledge. Company, maybe. The MP, no. So we need to come up with different ways of wrestling with that. And that's what we're setting up a policy institute to do, to try and run some of the experiments on how we provide knowledge, on how we facilitate those interfaces, which include, and here's the stick, setting up processes at the beginning of grant writing processes. Major grant applications come out from EPSRC to deal with the future of cities, for example. There's a good argument, I think, for bringing in policy communities and the decision communities who are desperate for knowledge about the future of livable cities, to have those communities at the table while scientists or engineers are formulating their research questions and agenda. Because in the long run, over a 5-year process, it will mean that the questions they answer are slightly more aligned or a little bit more addressed. It's not to say completely rewrite your research agenda, but often the difference between, I'm going to be very provocative and the difference between having a lot of impact and no impact is a 5% difference in the research agenda, not 100% difference in the research agenda. But in that 5% is everything, because it's either addressing a specific question that the policymakers have, or it's completely off base. Now the real question then becomes, what part of the university research, of research life, should be driven by that sort of process? And that's an open, and what's the right balance between blue skies research and societally driven policy research, the policy-oriented research? And it's a fair debate, and I don't have a good answer to that, but I would push and suggest we've been doing more blue skies research and less policy-driven research than we need, given the sustainability challenges, the inequality challenges, etc. And there's the same. I'll let you pick up.
This is a wonderful transition to our last part.
Which is about that 5%.
Exactly.
I'm going to stand up. Okay, so last speaker, last panel, last day, I'm going to read a story. So why fiction? Just very briefly, fiction because it's one way of communicating science. There's lots of science communicated in fiction. Brian Collins began by talking about the man on the street. Not sure quite who he meant, but there are a lot of people who think about science and what it does, using kind of fictional tropes and fictional icons. And Phil had a very good fictional icon earlier, the mad scientist. So it's also worth saying that journalism has taken its narrative shape from fiction. So it likes to have, journalists look for stories that have a beginning, a middle and an end. So we want to resolve, if we're writing big stories, we want to resolve the story in some way. Last, policymakers use fiction in scenario planning to think about the future. So this is actually a technique that policymakers use. Okay, so this is a story 100 years hence. We're at an awards dinner. We're at the Impact Awards in May 2114. And here she is, folks, the one and only Professor Madeline Davis. Vic Baker broadcast to the whole table as I approached. My heart sank and I smiled slightly too enthusiastically. Vic continued. How canny were you, Madeline? Insect proteins have hit the big time. I ate one of your new steaks at the Slim Duck last week. It was stupendous, the ultimate. Rumour has it that you guys are about to swallow your rivals, the termite people. Any truth? Vic was a favoured journalist at the communications giant Global News. Over the time I'd known him, he'd become inseparable from the corporate and political powers that owned him. No one upset Vic unless they wanted out. I managed a weak smile, which actually meant back off the smiley git, and attempted my best professorial voice. Well, when you say you guys, Vic, I presume you refer to my corporate funders. I have no knowledge of their business dealings. Of course, the termite people were pioneers of the early insect work, so we all stand on their shoulders. Maybe, but the termite lot don't have your flair for impact. Not many of your kind get the red carpet treatment like this anymore. He wafted one hand towards the decadent dining hall and made to give me a conspiratorial nudge with the other. I was in no mood for him. We were saved from an awkward moment by a strangely incongruent fanfare that suddenly burst forth as a dozen or so gleaming white chefs glided into the hall, followed by a flourish of beautiful boys who wheeled flaming barbecues behind them. A sing-song voice gushed in excitement. Ladies and gentlemen, here is the long-awaited and much-vaunted steak, the first Opteron filet. Please inform your personal waiters how you would like it cooked. The voice belonged to an eager young woman who almost shivered with the anticipation and joy of what was to come. We were seated on opposite sides of an elegantly wrought slate square, an impressive table indeed. It was far too wide for chatting. Anyway, she was probably interested in her own voice more than in mine. Her crystal timbre cut across the general hubbub of shuffling chairs and steak ordering, while the intermittent hissing of fat-hitting fire harmonised with her tone. The Opteron filet you're about to experience has been extraordinarily complex to execute. It is the product of an exquisitely talented technical team. She cast her eyes briefly in my direction. Opteron are delighted to put affordable steak back on the menu. Affordable, my foot. We at Opteron have tinkered with taste, with fat and protein ratios, and with texture. To do so, we have funded years of fundamental research, and along the way, we have launched successful mincemeat, sausages, burgers, and casserole meats. And at last, we have the ultimate, juicy, red-blooded steak. Enjoy, everyone. A cacophony of applause and cheering ensued as the effusive woman raised her plate high in triumph. A designed dining experience materialised at that moment in front of me. A steaming piece of meat, piled with airy circles of onion, was linked by a trail of jus to a few sparsely placed cubes of potato, meat, and corbett. Despite the sculpted beauty and the irresistible aroma tailored to trigger appetite, my stomach rebelled. Fundamental research. What was she on about? What was fundamental about splicing insect genes to bovine extracellular matrix genes? The process was worked out over 100 years ago. Worse, affordable, yeah, to the people who were currently devouring a dinner that took me and a whole team of others years to create. Oh my God, awesome, this is the best, wow, Prof. Vic looked a little crazed as he spoke, and red juice dribbled down his chin onto his pale cream faux suede shirt. I managed a vague good. You've done us proud, Madeline. You know you'll beat all your past best for impact with this one. You know what, I ventured. I really want to work on something different, something new, something unknown. Science has got itself all twisted up, Vic. We don't push the limits of knowledge anymore. Vic's face dropped. I was on dangerous ground, but I continued. I want the impact of my work to be social good, Vic, and I want it to be creative too. I stared at Vic's decimated dinner. Just a pool of ruddy-coloured juice and half a melted onion ring remained. All my hard work. Bloody hell, Madeline, you can't be having doubts now. You've achieved one of the greatest feats in food for decades. Delicious, high in protein, low in bad fats, perfectly designed to keep us fit. Isn't that social good? Now, I tell you where the challenge is. You do something similar with termite flavour and you'll go down in history. I picked at a few pieces of onion ring while he talked. I knew the routine. Well, termites, I began, but I was transported to my childhood in Gabon and a cone of hot, deep-fried chili termites shared with my mother. For a moment I was with her sitting on a rickety wooden table, swinging my legs so that it rocked. My bare thighs glued to the plastic checkered tablecloth. I would stuff one savoury treat after another while she nattered and enjoyed the colour of the market, the air heavy with frying and underlined as always by the smell of sweet, slightly fermented fruit. You all right, Madeline? Vic's voice cut through. You've hardly eaten. Have you finished? Sorry, miles away, I said. Yes, not hungry, thinking of termites, actually. I was just reminded of my first taste. Well, you know, in my view, you'll be on solid ground if you move on to termites. You'll be in the money. Vic trailed off. Like a pig after truffles, he sniffled out some gossip in a conversation on the other side of him. The gushing woman across the way was almost physically attached to the ear of Sir Ben Cumberly, head of Department for Food and Agriculture, who was here to present awards. Puddings were heading our way. Barbecues had finished and the meaty smells were giving way to wafts of fresh fruit, mango and minted pineapple. I wished they were real. My mind turned to the one alternative I had on offer. Though I had dodged making a decision for months, I hadn't ever turned it down. It could be life-changing. I would be turning my back on the establishment forever, but Frank was an old friend of my mother's who had family money. He'd gone that way years ago himself after making minute adjustments to costly surgical robots that were of use only to costly patients. Puddings came and I excused myself. I needed a break. Puddings went. On my return, the MC was in position centre stage. Your time is a-coming, Miss Madeline. Vic drawled like an idiot as I sat down. There were 4 awards before mine. We dutifully smiled, applauded and looked delighted. The award for Best Newcomer, the award for Financial Impact, the award for Highest Impact Factor, the award for Creative Impact, and then me, the award for Lifetime Impact. Goes to Professor Madeline Davis. Professor, please accept the award for Lifetime Impact for your unstinting work and creativity in making Opteron Phillips a reality. The most deliciously impactful research of the evening. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Professor Madeline Davis. Applause filled the room. It got louder as I stood. The stage was in the centre of the hall. It looked like a modified table, and I headed towards it. I marched through a wall of sound and a sea of faces. Then I turned toward the door and walked straight out. I could hear the speaker's voice fading. Professor Davis, Professor Davis, is something wrong, Professor? I grabbed my things and left. I took a cab up to Hampstead. I pulled ahead so that Frank could buzz me in at the gates. He met me with open arms. Delighted to see you, my dear. There isn't time to talk just now, but you'll join my little party first, I hope. One of my own particular researches that we are about to attend, a seance. I was a little phased. I didn't know Frank was a spiritualist. Perhaps he wasn't. He could be a conjurer, and actually that would be rather cool. Or perhaps he was interested in the psychology of it, also cool. And in that case, I was on board. I followed him in silence to a cosy room, red with deep red walls that clashed just a little with the wine-coloured drapery. A set of higgledy-piggledy antique chairs and a round table were offset in candlelight, and 6 or 7 people stood in relaxed, animated conversation. And my mind raced. Frank grinned and handed me a deep purple cocktail and announced, "Everybody please, allow me to introduce Madeline Davis, who is or was," and he gave me a quizzical look, "a professor of food technology. I hope I persuaded her to join our Little Blue Skies team. I think I would be right in saying that her broad interest lies in life science." Now, we're a little short of time for proper introductions, so can we continue with our evening as planned and chat later? Everyone okay with that? A generalised nodding and smiling ensued. The cocktail was divine, damson gin and sparkles. I could have downed it in one. Imaging on, ready to go? Okay, everyone, take a seat, breathe, relax. When the lights go out, join hands, and we'll wait to see what happens. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I did believe in research that pushed the limits of knowledge, and I was sure that no one could know in advance where that knowledge would come from and what it might be useful for. I was excited by the wonder of the unknown. The lights flickered and went out. I felt a thrill of apprehension. I took the leap. I sat down, I took a hand on each side of me, and I closed the circle.
Now, I'll take a deep breath. Okay, are there any questions? For the whole panel of panelists in particular, I think Sujata was first up, and then you, okay. I think I stand up. Okay, Sujata, Mike.
Sujata from the University of Nottingham. Question again to Philip, I'm afraid. So I think it was very productive when you sort of highlighted these misunderstandings between natural and social scientists. So I want to pick up on a couple of things. The first, I think, is that I understand this conference and this discussion to be about science advice and science advisors, if you like, rather than just scientists. And perhaps that's partly a way in which, if we were to label this conference again, we might add the word advice. But secondly, I want to pick up on your point about bias. So I think when social scientists say that science advice is inherently politicized or is part of a politicized process, what they mean there is not bias, I think, in the way that you're talking about, which is something deliberate, it becomes mere opinion or that kind of thing. What they're talking about there is, going back to what I said before, what are the conditions under which this particular scientific fact was produced? Not in the sense of bias, not that it was the result of fraud or whatever. And the opening up those conditions to different interpretations. I think that's really at the nub of this thing. So if I can just just give one quick example. There's one of the very famous studies in this field. It talks about how an advisory committee on pesticides provides advice on a particular, basically Agent Orange pesticide, and say, meet certain thresholds of safety. Now, the point is, what are the conditions under which that pesticide was tested in the lab? Questions arising about the preference for type 1 versus type 2 errors, questions about animal models and its transferability to humans, and questions about, can the people using the pesticides on the field, can they actually meet the conditions in the lab? Those are the kinds of questions. So I think that's why people say, or social scientists say, science advice is part of the research process.
Yeah.
I don't know the question.
I think that you're better than
Okay. No, it's what's very interesting is in terms of science advice, what struck me on the way in, and it follows on from Roger, who unfortunately isn't here anymore, this idea of advocates versus honest brokers. And I still don't get the honest broker thing, I must admit. But the interesting thing with advocacy is that time and time again during that Royal Society and the Scientists Scheme, what comes across is that there are very few scientists who are involved in terms of politics. That means that the people who are involved are a pretty well self-selecting group. They have certain attributes that may not be the norm if I can drop into sociology speak. So that's actually quite, that may well be setting an overall perception of how scientists actually connect with policy, which may be, slightly distorted. Maybe to actually get to that position where they are having influence, they have to forego some of the scientific rigor and advocate certain. But that's not how science works. Exactly the questions. Every question you came up with is a scientific question. And my concern is the idea that this is the feeling I got, or the impression I got from that heated debate on the first day, was that the argument from the social scientists is that pretty well all data, all evidence is tainted. That you can never accept the values, you can never disentangle, what was the word, disentwingle, whatever, the scientific evidence from the sort of values of the person who's delivering that scientific evidence. And if that were the case, that's deeply unsettling for any scientist, because we spend our lives trying to, as you do as a social scientist, trying to disconnect.
But just to quickly say, I don't think it's about personal values. It's about these, to the point there is that these kinds of questions, which you're calling scientific questions, we would say are value-based judgments.
Okay, what's your definition of value then? It's a vocabulary, it's a don't towards a vocabulary. A lot of these.
Well, so if you, so the question about preferring a false negative or a false positive, that's a value-based judgment in statistics.
I'm just wondering, because I think this is about the role of a scientific advisor who probably has to make value judgments, rather than the role of a scientist who has to give input to the scientific advice process. But I think that's sort of, yeah, okay. Answer. Oh, yeah, sorry, actually you were first. That answer. Sorry, I don't want to...
I have a sort of question for Reiner and then a follow-up question for Jason. I don't know whether I misabsorbed or misheard, but okay. In the lead up to the financial crisis, mathematicians played the role of honest broker, science arbiter, pure scientist. The one piece that was missing in Roger's quadrant was the advocate. And there were significant concerns about financial regulatory structure and whether it was robust enough, and they were ignored. And there's one story of Paul Embrechts, who's probably the world leading expert on financial risk. He's Belgian based in Switzerland, and he jointly authored a report with John Danielson of the LSE about an academic response to Basel, and he was very critical. And he did the launch in London, and it was picked up by the FT and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, very interesting. Took the plane back to Switzerland, was on the train back home, and he spied the Swiss finance minister across the corridor. He had the report in his pocket, he went up and said, "You must read this." we watched the finance minister read it, and Paul enthusiastically went back to him and said, so what did you, and the response he got from the finance minister was, the early bird captures the world. And Paul was completely perplexed by this response. But what it was, is if we're so advanced, we're going to make money. Let's not worry about it. Now you think, okay, that was then, things are different now. This foresight, to the report on computer-based trading, basically one of the conclusions was, well, it could all go tits up, but people are making money, so let's leave things as they are. Now, you say these commingled roles, hybrid roles, are dangerous. What advice would you give to me? I actively engage with professional bodies. I actively engage with financial actors. I think that is an important role for me. I think it's an essential role for me. So do you suggest I shouldn't take on that hybrid role of scientist and advocate? And then going on to Jason, where is finance in your department's curriculum? And if it's not there, why not?
So, I think this is a quick reply because the answer is it's not negative at all to be an advocate, and I think that's also the message Roger gives. So it's a choice, he says. So you can choose roles, and you can choose a hybrid role that goes beyond the pure scientist. What I try to show is that if you think it's an ideal to combine as many as possible of those roles, then it becomes very dangerous. So being an advocate for a certain policy in the financial sector based on your mathematical, statistical experience is not a problem at all, but you should be aware of the fact that you are speaking as someone who goes slightly beyond the professional qualifications because you feel strongly about that something is right and needs to be done. So Steve would have called that you are then acting as a citizen.
Just to build off Reiner's point before getting into your question about the department, I would say I wasn't unfortunately here for Roger's talk earlier, so this may have been covered, but it's important when playing that role in political processes to understand the political process in which you're intervening. The fact that the finance minister turned around and said the early bird gets the worm, well, it's actually not that surprising because every incentive structure for that minister is to make damn sure their government gets elected the next time, and having an economic crash on their watch is not a good way to do that. Or saying, actually, we're going to change our financial system so that we don't make as much money. We'll let the Londoners do that because they assume more risk. Well, understanding the values, the drivers, the motivations, and how the political structure is processed means you can have a better understanding of where and how that advocacy is effective. And I think that's one of the big challenges.
But it also points, because you in a sense you answered my question to Reiner, because it points at you.
Yes, the individual has, I think like...
No, I mean, points at you as understanding that policy framework. Who here is developing this understanding? I'm a mathematician.
Fair enough, but so what I would put back to you though is, going with Reiner's, if you're playing an honest broker role, which I'm not, again, I won't try to unpack all of that, but in shifting from an honest broker into an advocate, if you're going to consciously choose to be an advocate, I would argue that you, as an individual being the advocate, have a responsibility to educate yourself, to find others who have an understanding of that political process. Go to any bar on Whitehall and you'll run into people who know that process really well. And that sounds stupid, but that's actually a piece of advice that I took to understand the Whitehall system. My accent is clearly not British, and the system here is very different from the one in Canada or the US. Going down and meeting people from Whitehall was a critical way of understanding the dynamics and where the pressure points were for evidence to be useful versus, to use a sailor's phrase, pissing into the wind. And I think that's a really important thing for people to begin to understand is where and how it's effective. To get to your point about finance in the curriculum, the answer is yes, but with an asterisk and a footnote, which is, given how much we're trying to pack into a 12-month curriculum, the amount we have done justice to the finance issue is, we haven't done it justice is the short answer. And I think there is a very, we have concentrated on natural science, social science, non-economic knowledge more than economic knowledge, in part because the paradigm of most public policy schools, so we're a department of public policy with science, tech, and engineering firmly up front, but most policy schools in the world, a la the Kennedy School at Harvard, where I've studied and taught, other places, at Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, etc., economics is 70% of the curriculum. Now, it's classical economics and finance, and taking on that particular battle is not something that, as a new department teaching our first program this coming year, we felt capable of taking on to begin with. So there's a lot of issues around that but that almost is worthy of a new department in and of itself to take that one on. But that's a whole different question. So.
Please, answer.
Yes, Alistair Taylor, University of Nottingham. Going back to the discussion earlier about values, I saw a talk by Colin Church, who's a leading civil servant in DEFRA, and he said when someone came to him with a piece of evidence, scientific evidence, he asked, why did you choose that experiment? Why did you ask that question, answer it with that experiment under those conditions? Why didn't you do experiment B or try and do something, ask a different question? And that was his view of where the values come into the evidence. And then more back to the general theme of circling the square, I wonder if we need to be a little bit more honest with each other about our motivations as to why people become scientists, why they become researchers, why they become social scientists who are interested in science, why people step into industry rather than carry on in academia. And I think actually having those discussions up front perhaps may help then discussions of where do we go next and how do we communicate better with each other. Because I think there's this whole idea, this fantastic idea of the individual scientist becoming then institutionalized, and then you get the stereotypes that come along with it, and the same with the social scientists. Come because perhaps we're not honest enough at the start about why we're doing this type of research.
So for me, disinterestedness has always been a key aspect of the scientific method. That's why the impact agenda, if I'll be brutally honest, rankles so much of me. Is that it's arguing that you should put your goals at the right at the start. So you'd say, I am aiming for this point, but exploratory research is not about that. And that's why I became a scientist. I did not become a scientist to, sort out R&D problems for, industry. I became a scientist because there were certain questions about nature, or any questions about nature. It's building on the body of knowledge is what a PhD is about. That's my, that's why the impact agenda rankles so much for me. And I must admit, the idea that technology transfer offices are efficient.
I never said they were efficient. Effective. More effective than they were before.
Well, I don't know about that. It's worth reading Washburn's work on that. In fact, they usually act as, I think if you took them out of technology transfer offices, and that was the sort of, at the policy interface, that would be very bad modeling, because most of those don't even work even.
It's, let me come back. Can I just respond to your points, and then, please, because there's a couple of things on this, picking up about things. The first is about the picking of the experiment issue. And actually, this is one that, it goes back to the point raised earlier about the values in the science often being at the picking of the experiment level. But that assumes a certain intentionality of outcome, which I genuinely think is missing from a lot of science that is done. Let me say it this way, that take the Agent Orange example that you were using. It's a perfect example where picking an experiment is based on the scientist's understanding of the question they're trying to answer quite often without any connection between whether that question has policy relevance or not. And I think that's one of the questions, that issue of whether or not scientists should, when defining their questions, take into account the policy outcomes, is one that's at the heart of the impact agenda to some extent, or it's at least one that the impact agenda raises. Because when you're dealing with my argument, or the argument of setting up a policy institute, is actually to try and draw in what are the implications of choosing different experiments. For DEFRA, for example, if you just tweaked your experiment like this, the knowledge would be directly applicable to a policy challenge we're facing. Whether and how much science should be doing that sort of shift of questions goes back to debates of the Haldane principle at the beginning of the last century.
Which, as you know, the history of which is checkered.
It's highly checkered, but I think it's an open question of, I don't agree with putting the idea that picking of the experiment is intrinsically a value-based decision. But as you add intentionality into it, it starts to become an issue, a question of values, and a question about it. And to go back to that question of motivation, a lot of scientists do go in to just do scientific research. But I went into my physics trajectory, my PhD in physics, because I wanted to change the world. I wanted to make the world a better place. And I know a lot of PhD students who went on into environmental science or physics or anything else because they wanted to develop the technology to make the world a better place.
This is why it's balance. It's about balance. And your question about my other concern is that it's not a question of societal good. It's a question of, as Brian Collins, if we go all the way right back to the start, said, it's about economic growth. Don't stop. And how can we up our GDP? That's what it's about. And it's about corporate good, as Stuart has said. It's not about society.
I think that's one, so that if there's one thing I think we can and should do in the next 5 years before the next RAP, because there will inevitably be one, is shift the debate, shift what the impact agenda means. Because I think that is an open conversation that we can and should influence to say, impact for us means societal value and this whole ESRC focus on sustainable prosperity now is about questioning, is it about growth? Or is it
the problem with the Haldane, I'll shut up after this, but I've had these debates with RC. Yeah, definitely. But the worrisome, the problem is, with the Haldane principle, I would say the Haldane principle is a nonsense, because the idea that the research councils are arm's length from the government is ridiculous, because not only is there direct influence, there's indirect influence. What do the research councils want to do? They want to secure as much money for research, Lord, they want to secure as much money for research in each comprehensive spending. How do they do that? Well, they make damn sure that, for example, when Willits comes up with his 8 great technologies, that they align, And that's not just for directed programs. Now, with the Pathways to Impact Statement and the National Importance Impact Statement, it affects all of science. So the idea that you will pull out 60% is responsive, low, blue skies, and the rest is gone.
But I think, so my last point on this is going back to the Haldane principle versus the operation in practice, which has never been written down, but that's the whole, but I think this really does need to be a discussion about principles we're trying to achieve and how to really operationalize them. Because it's the operationalization that becomes political as opposed to the principles. And it's that process that needs to be, but often, just as the debate about the facts versus values often ends up focusing on the facts rather than the values, so too does the debate about science funding end up focusing on seeming debate about principles when it's actually about the practices and the processes. And if we're going to fix the system, we can at least agree on the principles first and then argue about how we politicize operations.
I have agreed. Okay, I can't.
Hi, I'm Carlos. I'm doing a PhD with Nikita. My PhD is about exploring the narratives of people engaging with interdisciplinary work. And for doing that, I interviewed 27 researchers all over the university, from zoo archaeology to mathematical neuroscience. Well, and I added to that 27 papers published in Science Careers and Nature Jobs, in the New Scientist. So after 9 months analyzing those narratives, I found, of course, some values, some qualities required for doing interdisciplinary work. And, in all these 50 or so sources, I found that, for example, people talk about humility, giving and taking, and being overt about their limitations of their knowledge. Meaning these that, basic questions or asking stupid questions to your collaborators are welcome. So I think from this, the way I would try to contribute a little bit to circling the square is, finding the common ground that, of course, social scientists calling people in the humanities, need to recognize that they are not probably the way they write, the way they communicate can be not clear for the ones that don't know, well, that are not used to the language. But also scientists, when interacting with people from the, let's say, the weighty disciplines or the, well, from the social sciences, how to let go the, how do you call it, the 9.81, well, the gravity argument, and bearing more in mind the uncertainty principle, because I think probably that's easier only, okay, not all the time, but only when collaborating with social scientists. And, well, I guess that was like my own comment.
I don't think there's any more used principle and misunderstood principle in science than the absurd.
Use it as a metaphor rather than principle. But yes, more humility all around, I think, would not go amiss, I think. Okay, I think, yeah, Angela.
Okay, I think that's actually, I think my comment is actually relevant to this, but I want to start by actually picking up, Philip, slightly on your point about social science communication and jargon and so on. As I said, I've read Philip's book. I think is very important. I think there are some profound issues around how social scientists express themselves. However, to say that physicists are always clearer, it depends on the context.
No, I didn't say that.
Yeah, no, well, you kind of did. And if you're looking at your own specialist work, then I couldn't just pick that up and read it. The difference partly is that physicists have been actively trying to and been encouraged to communicate publicly for over 100 years. Frankly, social scientists, I think we've only started thinking about this very recently, and that's our bad. But further to that, within the realms of people who are doing things around STS and science and policy, if I was to do a case study of your specific field, after a little while I would be reading those papers and I would be understanding them. And that's part of what we do when we're doing this kind of research in history of science and sociology of science. Further to that, I think if scientists are wanting to engage in these conversations about society, then there needs to be a bit more willingness to pick up and learn and be prepared to engage with the philosophy, the sociology and the history on our terms. So it's partly about, mutual humility.
Can I pick one?
Yeah.
So the person I read a lot of sociologists is John Simon. And the reason I can read Simon is Simon came from a physics background and became a sociologist. It's a question of overcomplication. There is an awful lot. I can take a piece of sociology in a paper and translate it very easily into very simple, very clear, single clause sentences, not sentences that go on for 2.5 paragraphs. This is the issue. Whereas in science, there are certain things. I talk about scamming, tunneling, microscopy. Tunneling has a particular thing, or microscopy has a particular. But there are certain phrases I will agree. But what we've got to do is try and simplify our language. And in sociology, in the vast majority of cases, what is happening is that very simple concepts are getting dressed up, or relatively simple concepts are getting dressed up in very complicated language. Whereas what we try and do in the, I'm sorry to say this, but hard sciences is to take down difficult concepts and get down to the essence of what they are and try to do that. You're absolutely right. You pick up a science, possibly I'm stereotyping, yes. But, I agree that you pick up science papers and the language, the mathematical language in particular, may in some cases be impenetrable, but that's because there's a difference in the level of conceptual understanding you need. It's not a question of we've dressed this relatively simple concept up in it. Oh, sorry, but it's, I've sat down and read quite a lot of sociology. I've tried to read a lot of sociology. And, one of you, it's not like Billig is coming from outside the field, he's a sociologist. And it was, so when I found that book, it was like, right, it's not just me.
Sorry, I think that we are reaching the limit of time and space, I'm afraid. So, sorry. We have to have lunch.
You can't say that, sorry.
No.
I'm supporting the social scientists.
I mean,
we overall look at our own literature and in terms of where this wonderful bastards, very complex, easy to read is. That's a bit I think for our favourite, I think.
Fair enough. But the issue is the question of complexity. And just the level of language you mean, the level of complexity in the language and the level of complexity in the concept.
I'm not saying that
it's important to the thing that wants to be told. Sorry. Okay. One question, two questions here, and then one question over there. Okay, you two. You first.
One of the problems I've had with some of the discussions that took place earlier is looking at my own career and realising the importance of serendipity in science. Some of these breakthroughs I've had in my career have come from mistakes and completely unexpected results. And I've then met a lot of dogma, actually, in the scientific community where I've had to go. Maybe 5 to 10 years, people would simply say that I must be wrong because it disagreed with so much that people don't use. And again, it's around the context of the experiments and what people really understand in their data. And that's improving all the time as it gets more sophisticated and we get a better understanding of what it is actually measuring. But I think that's was a big dilemma for me in some of the discussions around, for example, trying to predict what your impact is going to be at the beginning of the experiment. And what I find myself doing increasingly is simply trying to fill in the forms in such a way that I can give my research group time to play and to give them the opportunity to create that serendipity when they start talking to science. And Philip, you've probably been through similar processes yourself.
So, for example, I don't know a scientist who's written a Gantt chart and started a project and followed it in between 3 months.
That's fiction, right?
And the question for Reiner, I really love the matrix of the journalists, scientists, politicians. Is there a fixed column from that, which is the person who will speak of the general public? And are they represented by politicians, or are they looking for something different from scientists, which we should perhaps think about looking?
That's a good question, but yeah, I think it's political scientists would probably describe that as a problem of diffuse interests. It's a very big amorphous population. They have different views, different interests. The question is, how are they represented? And we had earlier the example of the Badger call, that there was conflicting views how much public opinion tends equal value. And what seems to happen is that the well-organized interests have more influence than people at the political level. And the groups I identified there, I think, are the ones that are crucial for policy making under conditions of uncertainty. So I think the general public.
An agenda that is not what the general.
But it's not visible. It's only effective as it becomes visible. And how can you do that? Through the media, through policy initiatives, through scientific research, or when you go into an interest group and get campaigning.
Okay, last question.
Discussed in some ways about the role of the dangers of scientists. Thanks very much. The role of scientists getting involved with the media. I want to explore some of the dangers of that, potentially with the example of David Nutt, who's come up earlier in the discussion. David Nutt seems to overstep the mark of scientist and confuse when he's talking about scientific work and talking about talking as a citizen, not a scientist, as it were. For example, he recommends alcohol sensors in every car, extending from his actual research into the dangers of alcohol compared to heroin, for example. And that's caused him to get a lot of ridicule from the citizens who have suggested that He doesn't take into account the practicalities of what he's recommending. Could he bring science, can scientists bring science into disrepute by potentially stepping over the line from representing science and confusing that into to speaking as citizens?
I think scientists can bring science into disrepute by all kinds of means, and advocacy may be one. And I think, that maybe have been overstepping in that case, or it looks ridiculous, but it's his right as a citizen to have these views and pronounce them. So I don't think there's a particular problem with advocacy. I think the problem with him is that he believed in evidence-based policy making, lest the policymakers know where the limits are, and he tried then to bang on and prove his point, when realizing that he lives in a parallel reality.
Just add up. Let me just respond quickly on that. That proposal, I'm just going to use that very specific example that you raised about alcohol sensors in cars. The idea that a scientist should be critiqued for proposing, or should be bring something to you by proposing a policy response, I think is wrong. I think actually by studying a problem and thinking about what are the consequences of a problem, oftentimes that can lead to an inspiration on, well, here is a potential way of solving the problem. Now, the question then becomes, does one grab that and just say, I now have an answer and I'm going to advocate for it, which is a political act, and one every citizen is entitled to do, because you can come up with all sorts of solutions, like a stake on a steering wheel rather than a seatbelt to get people to drive safer. There's a lot of reasons, but they will definitely make people drive safer. But it's almost certainly not going to be aligned with societal values. So the next step is, how do you analyze that proposal that you put forward? There are scientific methods that you can bring to bear to look at things, but there's also policy issues to take into account. Just going back to the first comment we had here on the impact question, because I think these are coupled together in the sense that we make our own luck. Serendipity is not something. Why do we have scientific conferences? Because scientific conferences bring knowledge together and circulate it and create a dynamic of conversation, which is more likely to lead to new ideas and a collective share. The same is true with the science policy interface. And perhaps one thing we should be measuring on impact isn't in that impact box, do you know what your impact is going to be, but do you have methods of co-producing or at least interacting with? I think those impact boxes shouldn't be based on what do you think your answer is going to be, but should be based on, are you credibly engaging with people who might use that knowledge from the beginning?
Why does that have to be?
I'm not saying for all blue skies research.
But it is. This is again the operationalization. I think a perfectly legitimate answer to that box is not applicable. But there are a lot of parts of research where I'd actually say it should be very applicable, but you should be judged not on how creative you are on giving what your answer will be, but on how creative you are in creating your own luck, in creating an environment where that serendipity can happen, so that you are more likely to be tackling the sorts of questions that are more applicable in instant circumstances.
But that shows a level of understanding of what we're doing, and I think most of the people who are reading those boxes.
Operationalization, again, is a big issue with this, and it's setting the principles versus the practices, and I completely agree the practices need a hell of a lot of work.
One sentence we can do. So just on this point, it's a sort of an argument from authority fallacy, basically. So you've got authority in one aspect, does that blend across to something you're an expert in? So, I think we've got through the whole conference without mentioning Feynman once, which just can't happen. So Feynman was asked to define science for a conference of school teachers, and his definition is just a brilliant definition, which is science is the belief in the ignorance of experts.
Sorry,
that was a sociology then sentence.